As we meet here today, there is bad news, which is, as you may have learned once or twice, you're going into a job market at a moment of probably the worst economic crisis in the last 75 years. But the good news is you're doing it with a St. Peter's diploma. Our generation, in making all the mistakes that led to that crisis last fall, has screwed up big time. The good news is it's now your job to fix and surmount all of those problems, and I am sure that you will do a much better job than we have. It's a confusing time in America and around the world, and I think at other confusing times in history, probably the best way to try to understand what's going on and sort through the confusion is to look at earlier times when we've suffered through a similar period. The 1930s, when we Americans got through the Great Depression. The first year of St. Peter's, 1872, was not a great year. It was just before a huge economic panic and a very long depression. But if you look at history, it gives you a little bit of a reference point for what lies ahead. And the other nice thing about it is that sometimes it's a little bit reassuring that as dark as things may seem at the moment, if you look back in American history, we Americans have a tendency to get through these things and prevail. I can't help but remember in the late 1940s, the Secretary of State was George Marshall, who had been, needless to say, a great general in World War II. And the Russians were coming across Europe, threatening to conquer Europe, and Marshall's young aides came to him and said, "General Marshall, this is terrible. We've never seen anything like this." Marshall's reply was, "I have seen worse." And what he meant by that was he was general, he was the head of the army at the time that we Americans stormed the beaches of D-Day in 1944. He knew what it was like to get through these crises. And my point is that if you read history, if you read about presidents and other historical figures, it'll tell you a lot about politics, but if you think about it, learning about their lives can also teach you an awful lot about life. In all of your lives, you will experience love, you'll experience ambition, you'll certainly experience success, and you'll also experience, I wish it were not true, frustration, loss, and defeat. And I think one way to make the best of these experiences is to discover the life experiences of leaders who went before all of us. They all had these kind of life adventures. And if you tap into their life stories, their experiences become our experiences. It's a little bit like going into a murky forest, but doing so equipped with a map or a GPS. For instance, I mentioned ambition. One example of that is Lyndon Johnson, who was a very ambitious guy. Where did the ambition come from? Well, he grew up in a family in Texas that lost its money, lost its position in local society, made Johnson feel humiliated. He got himself elected to the U.S. Congress, but he had one experience that seared him. When he was a congressman, he got on an elevator in one of the congressional office buildings and saw the elevator operator and recognized him. He said, "Where have I seen this face before?" And with a shudder, he realized that the elevator operator was a former congressman who was defeated for re-election, and the best job he could get was operating that elevator. It instilled Johnson an even greater sense of ambition than the one he had. But throughout his life, although he was elected president and achieved other things, he was always aware of the fact that fate has an awful lot to do with success in one's career. And one of Johnson's aides told me that he and the president were driving down a street down in Texas, and they saw a guy who had drunk too much and was staggering around. He'd obviously not slept or showered for days, and the aide began to laugh, and Johnson said to him, "Don't laugh at that man. Remember that the difference between the way he is and the way you are is only a little bit of luck." Love. Theodore Roosevelt married a woman he deeply loved, but had the experience early in life of just after she gave birth to their first child, on the same day as Theodore Roosevelt's mother died, his wife died from childbirth. And Roosevelt was absolutely crippled with depression. He wrote in his diary, when her future seemed so bright and she had just become a mother, death came to her. And TR said into his diary, "The light went from my life forever." That's the way it seemed that day. But in retrospect, TR went on to marry someone else, had a very happy family, more children, got elected a very important president of the United States. His life resumed. I was talking about success. One form of success is military success. We Americans, when we won World War II, you can't think of a greater success than when we prevailed over the Nazis in Imperial Japan, and we were about the only country left standing in the world. And a lot of people went to Harry Truman, who was president, and said, "The Germans have been terrible, they committed the Holocaust, these were Nazis, we have to get revenge against the Germans to make sure they never do something like that again." And what Truman said was, "I'm not going to do that because I remember the experience of my mother." He had grown up in Missouri, his mother was from a Confederate family, and she remembered how the Union Army at the end of the Civil War came and took their horses and burned their barns, and Truman's mother was anti-Abraham Lincoln, anti-the-Union for the rest of her life. When Harry invited her to come stay in the White House for the first time, she told one of Harry's relatives, she said, "If Harry intends to put me in the bed in the Lincoln bedroom, tell him I'll sleep on the floor." That's how deeply she felt. Another is friendship. When John Kennedy was president, he was a little bit worried because the British Prime Minister was a man named Harold Macmillan, who was a generation older, very skeptical of Kennedy. And during one of their early meetings, they had a private meeting, and Kennedy went on complaining to Macmillan about the fact that his wife Jackie was getting very much criticized in the press. And Macmillan, who was older and wiser, said, just brush it off, Jack. It doesn't matter. And it just made Kennedy more irritated. And Kennedy said to Macmillan, "Well, that's easy for you to say, it's not your wife. How would you like it if the British press wrote that your wife, Lady Dorothy, was a drunk?" And actually, she did drink too much. And Macmillan was quite suave. He said, "Well, if the British press wrote that my wife was a drunk, I would just issue a statement saying you should have seen her mother." Friendship is even helpful to presidents. And as I said, you'll also inevitably experience frustration. I talked about Lyndon Johnson. He had frustrations of all sorts. One of the minor ones was when Johnson went back to Texas and built his presidential library, no one came because Johnson was very unpopular over Vietnam. So Johnson said, "How can I overcome this frustration?" And he remembered that the Johnson Library is across the street from the football stadium at the University of Texas. So Johnson called up the guy who makes announcements at halftime and said, "Next time at that football game with all those tens of thousands of people in the stadium, make an announcement saying, anybody who wants to take a leak or get some cool water can do it at the Johnson Library across the street." And the announcement was made. Thousands of people came to the Johnson Library, and it was the best attended presidential library in the United States as a result. You learn the way that people got through these kind of frustrations. And I also mentioned personal loss, and you also find that in the lives of leaders. I once spoke to President Eisenhower's son, John, and John told me he loved his father, but his father was always very distant toward him. He sometimes felt it was very hard to make a connection. And I began to look into the life of President Eisenhower, the father, and I found that shortly after he was married to his wife, President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, had a little son who they referred to as Little Ike. And when the son was about 2 years old, they used to march him around, and the father said, "I'm going to make him the best soldier in American history." Shortly after that, the child died of scarlet fever. And Eisenhower later wrote, "This was the biggest disappointment of my life, the one I've never," he even wrote 50 years later, "entirely recovered from." And so obviously what was happening with his son John was, Ike, the father, felt he did not ever want to get close to that child again because he didn't want to have to go through the pain that he had suffered with his earlier son. And through all of this, through all these frustrations and setbacks which we all have, from examining presidents, I don't know of any president or any leader who was able to make it through these things, through this kind of adversity, without the help of loving family and loving friends, all of which you have, I'm glad to say, in the class of 2009, and also with some kind of faith. John Kennedy was a Catholic, but his sisters always felt that they were a little bit more devoted Catholics than he was. Someone once said to one of Jack Kennedy's sisters that he was going to write a book on John Kennedy's Catholicism. Her reply was, well, it's going to be a very thin volume. But Kennedy, I think, was even more religious than he let on. Harry Truman was a lot more religious than he let people know, because he remembered the fact that when his grandfather, would hear about politicians who made a big point of their religion, his grandfather used to say, Harry, when you hear a politician praying too loud, go home and lock your smokehouse. But Truman felt that faith was something that guided him in a very important way. He loved reading the Psalms. He loved reading a lot about biblical history. And oftentimes when he was wrestling with a big problem, he'd go back to ancient history, biblical history, study people like Cyrus the Great. It helped him a lot to get through and make great decisions. Ronald Reagan, when he was growing up in Illinois, he had a mother who was deeply religious. And when Reagan was even in his early 20s, his mother would say, the Soviet Union is filled with communism. Whatever you do in life, I hope that you will do something to relieve the burden of communism from the suffering Russian people. And ultimately he did, equipped with his faith. So saying all that, I hope that you will get to read a little bit more history. I know that you've gotten to hear the great teachers here at St. Peter's. And with a little help from the memories of what these leaders did, standing on the shoulders of these giants of the past, I hope that you'll have all of their joys and more, and very few of the heartaches they suffered. And all I can say is that I could not be more proud than to be the newest member of the class of 2009. Congratulations to my fellow classmates and your parents and families. And as I start my new life as a St. Peter's alumnus, I have only two words to say: Go Peacocks!